So the topic suggestion was made to discuss timeout rooms. And for many of you, that may be a different term. It may be a quiet room or a problem-solving room. And the reason that is there's strict guidelines for a room that's specifically called a timeout room. In New York State, for instance, a timeout is not regulated. You know, there are no rules and regulations regarding a timeout, but there are rules and regulations regarding a timeout room. And here it is to be used in conjunction with a behavior plan. What that tells me is if you have a child who's being put in a room, a timeout room, a quiet room, a problem-solving room, an isolation room, you know what I'm talking about, a little closet with a door. You know, there are no windows generally. It isn't very big. If your child is being put in one of those and does not have a behavior plan, you have a huge issue. I, as a parent, have concerns about the use of these rooms, even with a behavior plan. So if I just described a way of de-escalation or punishment or intervention that is used on your child and he or she does not have a behavior plan, something needs to change yesterday. Some other important things to note about a timeout room is that it must be continuously monitored. A child should never be put in a timeout room and be left alone. That does not mean that there's always an adult in the room, but there has to be visual and auditory monitoring 100% of the time. The walls and the floors should be designed to prevent injury. This is one of my big, huge concerns. Most timeout rooms consist of cement walls. That is not going to prevent injury. If you have a child who is that out of control, they are likely to beat their head, kick, hit, and clearly we all know that the damage can be done when somebody hits their head against a cement wall. Again, if it's not called a quote-unquote timeout room, then generally they're okay. If they're calling it a timeout room, they have to meet specific standards. However, that does not mean you should not intervene and come up with a plan as to avoid the use of these rooms. They should be comfortable in temperature. You know, it shouldn't be cold, it shouldn't be hot. They should be clean. There should not be items in there that your child can use to hurt himself or others. And another important thing is the door must be unlocked at all times, and it should 100% of the time be able to be opened from the inside. These are strict rules. It is something that, as a parent, you've really got to be diligent about in knowing how they're used, when they're used, and why they're being used. There are times that they're necessary. I get it. You know, I have children who are at risk behaviorally, and I have children that have used them. But the idea and the point is to use them sparingly and only when necessary, and use them correctly. As a parent, they're scary. You hear those news reports of kids being hurt, and kids being left in there, and kids being locked in there. So clearly the fear is there as a parent, not knowing exactly what is going to happen and when, because we're not there. Our eyes and our ears are not there 100% of the time, so we don't know what's happening. So I encourage you, I implore you, do your research. Stop in for visits when they don't think you're going to be there. Be respectful about it, but this is your kid, and ultimately you are responsible. You know, if something happens, you're his parent, you're her parent. People are going to look at you for the answers or for blame. So it's in your control to understand exactly how they're being utilized and why they're being utilized. Open up that line of dialogue. Speak with the teachers and the professionals and the administrators that are using the timeout room or the quiet room. Know why they're using it. Know their thoughts. Ask those deep probing questions so that you know exactly when and how and why they intend to use it. Let them know your thoughts on the use. Let them know that you will follow up, that you expect the paperwork to be done, the documentation to be there. And every time the room is used, open that dialogue again. discuss it. Why did we have to use it? How can we change it the next time? Why did we do this? Great, you followed the rules and regulations here, but I don't like how this was handled. It's okay to do those things. In fact, it's necessary to do those things. Another important aspect of a timeout room is it should be implemented on your child's IEP. Understand that in emergent situations, the room can be used without your permission, without your knowledge, and without the IEP. However, if they're going to use it regularly as a part of the behavior correction and safety, it has to be put on your child's IEP. It has to specify the use, including the maximum amount of time he or she may need the room. And it has to be, they have to consider your child's age as well. So again, if it's being used regularly and it's not on your child's IEP, a CSE meeting, that's what it's in New York State, an IEP meeting needs to be called and needs to be held and it needs to be addressed. If they're going to continue using the use of a timeout room, I don't even care at this point if it's called a quiet room or a sensory room or a de-escalation room or whatever term that they're going to use. If they're going to use it regularly as a part of that child's behavior, it needs to be implemented in the IEP. The reason being is you want documentation. If they're using it by their choice and it's not part of a plan, chances are they might not be documenting it to the standard that is required. And you might not be knowing how often, the severity, why, when, that it is being used. So I encourage you to question. If it's being used for your child and it's not on the IEP, I would call a meeting today. I would discuss it at length. Go in open-minded, go in understanding that they can be used as an emergent situation, but that's not regular. If it's being used as emergency often, then clearly the program has to be addressed, and the program in general might be wrong for that particular student. One last important thing to remember. If a behavior plan includes the use of a timeout room in some way, shape, or form, they don't have to call you when it's being used, but there will be documentation that it was used, allowing you to see when, how, why, where, the reasonings behind it. The exception to this is the emergency. If your child is removed from the classroom and put in one of these timeout rooms on an emergency basis, the school must notify you. There's no question here. There's no open for interpretation. If they put your child in a timeout room and they deem it to be an emergency, they have got to notify you. Again, it gives you that chance to open the dialogue, to find out why, and to get some questions answered and maybe make some suggestions in terms of not using it the next time. Ultimately, there's no dignity in using a timeout room. We want our children to learn to be functional without it. And it's our job as parents to ensure that this school is trained so that they can be avoided.